Welcome back. In this recording, we're going to talk about the idea that we're going to take, or we are taking, a continuum approach to understanding feminist and qualitative research methods this quarter. This is highly compatible with social constructionism, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Don't forget, that's our underlying logic, right, or our approach. We're not positivists, we're social constructionists and feminists. Anyway, in order to understand the benefits of a continuum, we're going to first consider dichotomies. If you look at this list of words, you will probably have no trouble coming up with their opposites. I've done this assignment with, or exercise with hundreds of people, and they always give me the same answers. If you think of what the opposite of hard is, it's soft, man, woman, true, false, rational, irrational, or emotional, objective, subjective, white, black, right, wrong, or left, good, bad, mind, body, strong, weak, father, mother, science, and then usually either art, nature, or religion. That's the one that has the most variation. I find that interesting. But anyway, quantitative, qualitative, west, east, and up, down, right? If you don't think too hard about it, you just rattle them off, you know what the opposites of these words are because we've all, particularly those of us who were socialized in English, learned from birth to divide the world into two categories as though that is the full extent of it. However, thinking in terms of dichotomies distorts the way that we understand the world, including, absolutely, qualitative and feminist research methods. So we're going to talk about 3 ways in which dichotomies distort our thinking. This is a synthesis of feminist theory that relates to epistemology. And remember, epistemology is that underlying logic. In our case, it's a feminist social constructionism. But anyway, dichotomies are paired opposites, right? They say there's 2 and only 2 options. These are also referred to as dualisms or binaries, and both of those would be correct, for example, if you wrote them on an exam. But I usually use the word dichotomy. Anyway, this is not in the reading, but you do need to know it for the exam, so please be sure to pay attention and to let me know if you have any questions. There are 3 ways in which dichotomies distort our thinking. The first is they tell us that there's only 2 options, right? There's 2 options instead of lots of options, right? So if I ask you, um, what's the opposite of man? It's woman. Well, that presumes that there's only 2 kinds of people in the world, right? There's non-binary and gender fluid people. And even within the categories of man and women, we can divide those up into much smaller groups because there's lots of research that shows that actually XX and XY are not the only chromosomal approaches to understanding sex and gender. That there's actually there's several different genetic combinations, and then there's lots of other syndromes that have to do with genetics and hormones, particularly when fetuses are still in utero, that cause the development of sex characteristics. So it's not true to say that there's only 2 options. So the first way in which dichotomies distort our thinking is they convince us there's only 2 when there's actually a whole wide range of options, right? There are many, many, many shades of gray between black and white. Right? And we should honor that there's that whole continuum of possibilities. Okay, so that's the first one. The second way in which dichotomies distort our thinking is that they present as opposite what are actually interdependent for meaning. Let me explain what that means. So they say, for example, that man and woman are opposite. They are mutually exclusive categories, but actually that's not true. Man and woman are mutually dependent categories, meaning without the other one, it doesn't make sense. So if there were no such thing as women, there would be no such thing as men. There would just be human beings, right? If there was no such thing as, uh, you know, things that were really big, then we would not describe some things as really small. They'd just be the way they are. Many of you have been socialized to believe in a particular religion, and usually, particularly in Western religions, we are socialized to believe that there is good and evil, right? And that we have free will to do good because you wouldn't be doing good if you couldn't choose to do evil, right? It's like you don't get any credit for having done something good. You'd just be doing whatever instead of doing something good if it weren't possible for you to choose instead to do something evil. So these paired terms need each other. They're dependent upon each other. They are not mutually exclusive. They are mutually dependent. The third way in which dichotomies, and by the way, that's absolutely true of quantitative and qualitative research methods as well, right? We wouldn't have the other term if there weren't multiple ways of doing research. And there's a huge continuum between quantitative and qualitative. They are not opposite at all. The third way in which dichotomies distort our thinking is that they convince us, if there's two and only two options, then one of them will always be ranked as more valuable by society. If there's only two options, we seem to be constitutionally incapable of saying, and they're both good. So here's an example. If you only had two flavors of ice cream, and it was just chocolate and vanilla, and I asked you how many people prefer chocolate, how many of you prefer vanilla, right? You would have a preference between those two. Most, very, very few people would say they're equal to me, right? Instead, we value one of these. And if you look at the list of terms that are on the last slide, they are telling you that the words that are written down there, so the ones that I asked you for the opposite of, it's the ones that I've written down that are the more culturally valued in Western culture. Being up, being strong, being powerful. Men have more cultural power and prestige as a group, and of course not all individuals. And women are not without power, but uh, they did a study just last year, and couples still say if they're only going to have one kid, they'd rather have a boy. Although that preference is much stronger among men than it is among women. The majority of women say that, but it's not nearly as big a majority. Anyway, the point being that we don't seem to hold them all as equally good. So if we move past just chocolate vanilla and we went to Baskin Robbins where they have 31 flavors, or we go to Ben and Jerry's where they have zillions of flavors, right? If we can choose between um, chocolate peanut butter cup and New York super fudge chunk and brownie ice cream. You can tell I want some chocolate. All my examples have chocolate in them. They have other ones too, though, of course. With all those other flavors, right, then we don't have to uphold just one as being the better one. But when we only have two, we always value one of them more than the other. Not as individuals. This is talking about cultural norms. It's talking about systems of power. Okay, so now that we understand why we don't want to have dichotomies, we do want to have continuums. And this is a few things I'm having you read that I wrote. I think this may be the only thing I'm having you read, other than a few examples that we'll use for group work. And you're not reading all of it. If you would go to pages 597 and 598, which is where the large table is that I designed, what I want to talk to you about is, and this is all written out in the segment of the chapter that you read as well. But what I want to talk to you about is what this table says and how you can understand it. I'm going to start on the right side, which is the science or realist side, and I'm going to go all the way down. You'll notice on the left side that there are categories: goals, questions, methods, writing, researcher, vocabularies, and criteria. And I'm going to talk to you about all the science and realist side of the continuum of qualitative methods. The next step over from that would simply be quantitative methods. Right? And then I'm going to talk to you, swing all the way to the other side, and talk to you about the artistic and impressionist side, and then we'll end up in the middle briefly. But I'm going to go back and forth between the two pieces of paper because I want to go all the way down each column. So I'm going to do the science and realist column first. Okay, so basically, science and realist approaches to qualitative methods do the same thing that quantitative methods do, which is that they're trying to find generalizable facts that discover objective truths that are supposedly out there, right? That the researcher is trying to predict and control behavior. The questions that they then ask are all based on the researcher's understanding, right? They define what we can predict, what we can control, right? Very much looking at very specifically defined ideas or concepts, right? Then the types of methods that are used when you're doing this kind of qualitative is very specific types of coding, right? So textual data is data that's written out. You can make a transcript, or it could be your field notes, or it could be pieces you've downloaded off the internet from different kinds of hate groups, and you want to try to analyze the words that they, in the type of meanings that they used in their recruitment materials, right? So you could be analyzing those. It's often done through random sample. Frequencies of behaviors are things that you code for, and then you count how many of each one of the categories shows up in your data. And it's still very focused on, if not measurement, then very close to it. It's highly structured forms of methods. Going down to the next page, the writing on the right end of the continuum, right, on the science and realist side, uses passive voice, which Donna Haraway, a feminist theorist, calls the view from nowhere, and that's objectivity. The use of passive voice is the idea of saying the data were collected. The interviews were conducted by, the data was analyzed, right? Data were analyzed, sorry. And this kind of writing is very authoritative. It tends to be very dry, right? And it tends to emphasize the idea of objectivity, that the researcher is not involved, and that's the very next category. The researcher is presented as irrelevant to the results. Now, as feminist social constructionists, do we believe that the researcher is irrelevant to the results in any kind of research? Absolutely not. We don't believe that, but that is how the writing is set up on the right end of the continuum, right? And so then the vocabularies that we use, the type of words that show up there, again, sound very much like quantitative and talk about generalizability, right? And about control and prediction. The criteria that we use for analyzing the quality of research on the right side is, again, very similar to that which would be used for quantitative positivist research. And that is the key vocabulary word on that end of the continuum, by the way, is positivism and deductive, those two words. Okay, now to contrast that, let's swing all the way over to the artistic or impressionist side of the continuum. I often call it the artsy side. Either of those words is fine. The goal on the artsy side is not to do generalizable knowledge. It's to get super in depth, looking at the particular and the rich and the individual. And it's often to create something that is art, or at least that is trying to be artistic, artish, kind of arty, right? The kind of questions we ask are about coping with daily life and using our imagination and looking at uniqueness of experience. The methods are autoethnography, which you're going to be using this quarter, interactive interviewing, so not just one person interviewing another, but going back and forth, a lot of performance stuff and a lot of visual stuff. The type of writing uses first person. I collected the data. I wrote about this. Here's what I think. Okay. It often uses literary techniques, meaning that you write stories as though you were writing fiction. You're writing things that are true, but you try very hard to have character development and plot and very good descriptions that make it feel very evocative and very engaging. The researcher could be the main focus, right? Or it could be an equal focus between the researcher and participants. The researcher is not only not irrelevant, the researcher could be the whole subject or focus of the research. Or it could be the researcher's interaction with particular participants, and that could be the focus. Again, the vocabulary is different. It's artistic and interpretive and inductive on the artsy end of the continuum, right? A lot of different kinds of vocabulary, often bringing in creativity and aesthetics. Aesthetics are how we judge what is beautiful. We think about aesthetics when we talk about paintings and that kind of thing. And then lastly, the criteria are not at all the same as what are used in science. It's about, do the stories ring true? Do they resonate with us? Do they engage us? Do they move us emotionally, right? Are they plausible? Are they interesting? Are they pleasing, right? Do you feel engaged with the story? Just the same way you'd ask that in an English class. Did you like this short story or not? And why or why not? Okay, so if those are the two poles of the continuum, we don't accept that there is somehow only two options. There's a middle ground to the continuum. And those little figures that you see on the table are one of my students drew them, and they're attempting to show the idea that there's lots of space in between these. I don't have a lot of space because I was publishing this in a book that was a very specific size, but I'd like you to imagine that the art, middle, and science parts of the continuum are very far apart from each other. Okay, that the middle is huge and takes up about 80% of the continuum, and then there's 10% art on one side and 10% science on the far side, and then most things are at least a little bit of the other, right? So it's mostly art with a little bit of science, or it's about half and half, or it's mostly middle ground is very much in the middle, but a little bit sciencey, right? That idea is that there's lots of room there. So the middle is constructing what are called situated knowledges, meaning socially constructed meanings. We tend to look at patterns or the typical, so not something that's generalizable, nothing that can be counted, but we do look at how things, what kind of patterns appear when we get lots of data that really appear. We construct them, but and what kind of patterns can we discern? We tend to focus a lot of in-depth description and on understanding something, on asking questions about whatever is taken for granted. So in healthcare, it's very taken for granted, for example, that the doctor has all the power in the situation. And so I asked a lot of questions. I didn't take for granted that it should be that way, right? I tried to think about and ask questions about that. The questions that we ask then, right, are very focused on how the participants understand their world and how the participants and the researcher co-construct meanings together. They're also focused on pragmatic implications, meaning what useful knowledge can we get this? Not generalizable, but useful. So for example, I studied healthcare team for 2.5 years. I followed those people around, and then I interviewed them and spent a lot of time kind of debriefing with them as well. And the idea is that this did not generate generalizable knowledge. It was only one team after all. But I got so in depth with them that I came up with lots of very practical and useful ideas that other healthcare teams could use. Not exactly the same way, of course not, but really good insights onto things that they could try and adapt for themselves. The methods then tend to be somewhere between art and science, so a lot of meaning making. So interviewing, but with some flexibility, which we call semi-structured. Doing focus groups, doing ethnography, or what's also called participant observation. Looking for patterns, thematic, metaphoric, and narrative analysis, and grounded theory. These are very middle ground forms of qualitative analysis, and they emphasize looking for patterns in the data or themes. The writing in the middle of the continuum is also first person. We tend to use little brief quotes from transcripts and descriptions from field notes to illustrate the points we make. We put the data in there, right? We make a point and then we use excerpts from the transcripts or field notes or the things that we pulled off the internet, right? The materials from the hate groups that I mentioned earlier, right? And we put little quotes from them in order to demonstrate the point we're trying to make. In the middle, the research is not the main point. The participants are the focus of the research, but the participants' positionality, or which is another word for embodied standpoint, is important and is acknowledged. We tend to talk about who we are. I'm female. I'm heterosexual. I have a disability. I am in my early 50s. I am. I have had a lot of experience with the healthcare system, but I'm not a healthcare provider, right? Those kinds of things are important to know when you're going to go and judge the research that somebody did in the middle. The vocabulary is very much social constructionism, and post-positivism ranges from sort of what I call immediately post-positivist, just slightly left of the right side of the continuum, all the way through a very flexible post-positivism that starts to nudge up against social constructionism. This is about inductive research and very much emergent, meaning you're making themes and categories. You're trying to figure out what are the patterns in your data. That is what we do in the middle. And then the criteria tend to be flexible as well. The way we evaluate is not the same as we would the quality of something artistic or something scientific. Instead, there's a little bit of both. It's flexible. We'll talk more about criteria later.